In the beginning, when humanity was still young and the world was freshly shaped, there was a family whose story would echo through the ages. A family that carried both the weight of blessing and the stain of curse. It begins with Cain, the firstborn son of Adam and Eve, who carried in his hands the soil of the earth, tilling it as a farmer, yet also carried in his heart the shadow of envy. And when envy turned into rage, and rage turned into action, Cain struck down his brother Abel, the first innocent blood spilled in human history. From that moment on, Cain's name was marked, and his descendants would forever walk under the shadow of that act. But what became of Cain's offspring? The Bible hints, whispers, and in some places tells outright. Yet over the centuries, parts of their story, especially the writings of Enoch, were silenced, buried, or even banned from the canon of Scripture. What was so dangerous about the legacy of Cain's line? Why did certain books, tied to Enoch and Cain's descendants, disappear from the official story handed down by the church? And what secrets still lie within those forbidden lines? The story begins with Cain's exile. Cast out from the presence of the Lord, Cain fled east of Eden and settled in the land of Nod. It was there he built the first recorded city, a city he named after his son, Enoch. This is not the same Enoch who later walked with God and was taken up without tasting death. This Enoch was of Cain's line, a builder, an innovator, the founder of a civilization born out of defiance, yet stamped with brilliance. This city was the first attempt of man to anchor himself in a world now fractured by sin. It was a monument to permanence in the face of a curse that marked Cain as a wanderer. And here lies the paradox. The cursed wanderer became the first city builder. His offspring were not idle. They were creators, craftsmen, and pioneers. Jabal, one of his descendants, was called the father of those who dwell in tents and keep livestock. Jubal was known as the father of those who play the lyre and pipe, inventors of music. Tubal-Cain, another, was the first forger of instruments of bronze and iron, a master of metallurgy. From this cursed line came the seeds of human culture, agriculture, music, and technology. It is as though God allowed the brilliance of human creativity to spring even from the soil of rebellion. Yet alongside these innovations came arrogance, violence, and corruption. Generations later, from another line, Adam's righteous line through Seth, came a man named Enoch. Unlike Cain's son, this Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. His life became a mystery, a testimony, and a prophecy. The Book of Enoch, a writing attributed to him and preserved in fragments, expands on the story found in Genesis. It tells of angels who descended, of forbidden unions between heavenly beings, and human women, of the Nephilim, giants born of corruption, and of Enoch's journey into the heavenly realms. But here's where the threads begin to twist together. Because Cain's descendants were often seen as tied to violence, corruption, and rebellion, while Enoch, the seventh from Adam through Seth, was seen as the prophet who warned against such corruption. And yet, within the ancient writings attributed to Enoch, there are passages that speak of hidden knowledge. Knowledge of the stars, of the calendar, of judgment to come, and of the watchers who descended upon Mount Hermon. These stories were considered too dangerous, too strange, too mystical, and were eventually excluded from the canon of most Christian churches. The Book of Enoch was banned, or at least set aside, because it spoke too clearly of things the early church fathers feared would distract or mislead. And still, one cannot help but notice the forbidden stories of Cain's offspring and the banned writings of Enoch seem to intertwine. Cain's son, Enoch, represented humanity's first attempt to build civilization apart from God. The prophet Enoch, Seth's descendant, represented humanity's call back to God, to holiness, to walk in step with the divine. One built a city that would crumble into dust. The other walked into eternity without facing death. One line gave rise to violence, polygamy, and corruption. Lamech, a descendant of Cain, boasted of murder and bloodshed. The other line gave rise to Noah, the righteous man who found favor in God's eyes and through whom the world was preserved. Yet the Church's decision to silence or ban certain writings left these connections in shadows. The Book of Enoch, cherished by some early Christians and even quoted in the New Testament letter of Jude, was later cast out of the canon in the West. Why? Perhaps because it revealed too much about the fall of angels, the secrets of heaven, and the corruption of mankind. Perhaps because it suggested that Cain's descendants were more deeply entangled in the mysteries of the Watchers and the Nephilim than official tradition wanted to admit. Imagine for a moment what it must have been like to live in those days, when Cain's city bustled with music, livestock, and the clang of metal against stone, while Seth's descendants worshipped in simplicity, calling on the name of the Lord. Two cultures growing side by side, one exalting human achievement, the other clinging to divine promise. And in between them, voices like Enoch's, warning of judgment, calling for repentance, describing visions of cosmic battles between heaven and earth. The very survival of the Book of Enoch in Ethiopia, long after it vanished from Europe, is itself a mystery. Why there? Why preserved in the highlands of Africa while being erased from the libraries of the West? Some believe it is because Ethiopia held onto a memory the rest of the Church tried to bury, a memory that Cain's line, Enoch's visions, and the forbidden history of the Watchers all belong to one grand story of rebellion, judgment, and redemption. But what of Cain's city, his offspring, his legacy? What if their innovations, their music, their tools, their cities were not neutral, but tainted with the knowledge given by the Watchers? What if the very reason the Church feared Enoch's writings was because they unveiled the connection between Cain's children and the corrupted wisdom that spread through the Nephilim? As we trace these stories, it becomes clear the battle was never simply human, it was cosmic. Cain's act of murder was more than the spilling of Abel's blood. It was the opening of a door. Through that door came a line that gave rise to culture, yes, but also to corruption. And standing in opposition was Enoch, the prophet who saw visions of heaven, who recorded the rebellion of angels, who declared that judgment was coming upon all the ungodly for every deed and every word. And so the story unfolds like a tapestry. Cain's Enoch, the city builder, crafting monuments of human defiance. Seth's Enoch, the prophet, carried away into the presence of God. Cain's descendants, fathers of music, metallurgy, and livestock, shaping the foundations of human culture. Seth's descendants, fathers of prayer, prophecy, and covenant, shaping the foundations of faith. And somewhere between them, the shadowy figures of the Watchers, imparting forbidden wisdom, birthing giants, corrupting flesh. Why did the Church silence this? Was it fear? Was it strategy? Or was it something more? An attempt to protect the faithful from stories too strange, too unsettling, too entangled with myth and legend? Yet the very fact that Jude quotes Enoch suggests that the early believers did not dismiss him. They recognized his voice. They saw him as a prophet who spoke of judgment yet to come. And here is where the question sharpens. If Cain's offspring were innovators and Enoch the prophet was a visionary, what happens when the two collide? What happens when the brilliance of human creation meets the corruption of fallen angels? What happens when music, metal, and cities are turned into weapons of rebellion? Does this explain the violence that filled the earth before the flood? Does this explain why Noah alone found favor? The silence of the canon only deepens the mystery. For centuries, voices have whispered that Cain's descendants carried knowledge not meant for them, knowledge that bled into the forbidden unions of the Watchers. That the very arts, sciences, and crafts that we now celebrate as the foundation of civilization may have had origins tangled with rebellion, and that Enoch, the prophet, saw it all and declared it doomed. The story of Cain's Enoch and Seth's Enoch is not just about two men with the same name. It is about two destinies, two paths humanity could walk. one that ends in cities that crumble and bloodlines that vanish in the flood. The other that ends in a man taken alive into heaven, testifying that walking with God is the only path that leads beyond death. And so we stand in the tension of these forbidden stories. Cain's offspring, innovators yet cursed. Enoch the prophet, visionary yet silenced. The watchers, angels yet fallen. All threads in the same tapestry, a tapestry the church chose to fold up, hide away, and declare unsafe for the faithful. But fragments remain. The Book of Enoch still whispers of angels chained in darkness. Cain's genealogy still hints at legacies of brilliance and blood. And the story is not finished, because what was banned, hidden, or silenced often returns in new light. The untold story of Cain's Enoch and Seth's Enoch is not just ancient history. It is a key to understanding why humanity has always been torn between brilliance and corruption, between progress and rebellion, between the city of man and the kingdom of God. And as we peel back these layers, the question becomes unavoidable. What did Enoch truly see? What knowledge was Cain's line truly carrying? What truth was the church unwilling to preserve? These mysteries are not locked in the past. They are stepping stones leading us deeper into a history most of us were never meant to know. After Cain's exile and the rise of his city, questions linger like smoke in the air. What was life truly like in those early generations, when Adam and Eve still lived long enough to see children and grandchildren stretching across centuries? How did Cain's children look upon the first family, knowing their father bore the mark of murder? Did they resent the curse, or did they embrace it as fuel for ambition? Scripture gives only glimpses, but traditions outside the canon, fragments of oral history, and writings considered too dangerous for inclusion, attempt to fill the silence. One theme repeats. Cain's descendants were restless. They sought permanence through walls, innovation through craft, identity through power. Jabal invented tents and animal husbandry, mastering the wild to serve human need. Jubal discovered music, stringing chords to produce rhythm, weaving notes to stir the soul. Tubal-Cain forged metal, pulling hidden strength from the earth, shaping it into tools, weapons, and ornaments. Yet notice, none of these inventions are tied to worship of God. They are gifts of ingenuity, but they are silent about the giver. It is as though Cain's line turned the blessings of creation inward, making culture without covenant. This silence troubled ancient interpreters. Some rabbis whispered that Cain's line was too easily influenced by otherworldly powers. If the Watchers, those angels described in Enoch's writings, did descend to corrupt humanity, who would be more vulnerable than the descendants of the first murderer? It is not hard to imagine Cain's children already carrying a legacy of rebellion, eager to embrace forbidden wisdom. The forging of metal, the invention of music, the mastery of animals, all could be twisted. Music can soothe or it can seduce. Metal can plow a field or pierce flesh. Cities can protect or enslave. What if Cain's descendants, with their brilliance, opened the door to corruption wider than anyone imagined? The Book of Enoch tells us of the Watchers teaching humanity charms, enchantments, the knowledge of the stars, the crafting of weapons, and the adornment of women with cosmetics and jewelry. These teachings were not presented as blessings, but as snares, knowledge that intoxicated, knowledge that enslaved. And though Enoch himself descended from Seth, not Cain, many early interpreters suspected that Cain's descendants were the first to embrace this forbidden wisdom. Cain's Enoch built a city. What if that city became the first laboratory of corruption, a place where angelic secrets mixed with human ambition? This possibility frightened the early church. To acknowledge it would mean acknowledging that human culture, even at its roots, carried a taint of rebellion. It would mean the arts, the sciences, and even the foundation of civilization were not neutral, but born in tension between God's gift and demonic distortion. The Book of Enoch lays bare this tension, but instead of being preserved widely, it was branded as too dangerous. By silencing it, the church could present a simpler story. Cain was cursed, Seth was blessed, and the line of Cain disappeared in the flood. Yet the silenced writings suggest something far darker and far more complex. Take Lamech, a descendant of Cain, who boasts to his wives that he has slain a man for wounding him. His words drip with pride, violence, and polygamy. He is the first man recorded to take multiple wives, twisting marriage into a tool for domination. His arrogance mirrors the corruption Enoch later describes among the giants and the Watchers. Violence is no longer hidden in the shadows. It is sung aloud, written into poetry, celebrated as strength. In Cain's line, murder became heritage, and heritage became identity. At the same time, the line of Seth is described in Genesis as the line that called upon the name of the Lord. Here, then, are two parallel paths. One line cultivates cities, crafts, music, and metallurgy, but also embraces arrogance, violence, and lust. The other line cultivates worship, prayer, and covenant, culminating in men like Enoch, who walked with God. The tension builds across the generations until it breaks open in the flood, where the corruption of humanity, mingled with the rebellion of heaven, fills the earth with violence. But notice something. The flood wiped away Cain's line, yet the flood did not erase the possibility of corruption. For even after the waters receded, echoes of Cain's offspring, echoes of the forbidden knowledge, seemed to remain. The Nephilim are described as being present both before and after the flood. The same temptations re-emerge in Nimrod, the mighty hunter, the builder of Babel. It is as though the spirit of Cain's line lingers like a shadow across the pages of history, reappearing wherever humanity tries to build apart from God. Could this be why the Book of Enoch was suppressed? Because it reveals that Cain's offspring were not merely a footnote in the genealogies, but a living thread of rebellion that influenced entire civilizations. Could it be that their connection to forbidden knowledge exposed truths too unsettling for the official canon? If Cain's children pioneered music, metal, and cities, and if the Watchers corrupted those very inventions, then every human achievement would carry a question mark. Was it inspired by God or tainted by rebellion? Consider music. Jubal is called the father of those who play instruments. Music can elevate the soul toward heaven, but it can also inflame lust, rage, or despair. Some early traditions suggested that the Watchers twisted music into incantations, turning song into sorcery. If this is true, then Cain's descendants were not merely artists, but the first magicians. The line between worship and witchcraft, between harmony and manipulation, was blurred from the start. Consider metallurgy. Tubal-Cain forged bronze and iron. To shape the elements of the earth is no small thing. But iron can make plows or swords. Bronze can craft ornaments or idols. Ancient writings hint that weapons of war were born here in Cain's line. Was Tubal-Cain the first blacksmith of violence? Was his skill a gift distorted by the fallen angels? The Book of Enoch claims that Azazel, one of the Watchers, taught men to craft weapons and women to adorn themselves with seductive beauty. If Cain's descendants were the first to embrace this teaching, then their legacy was not merely technological progress, but the corruption of the world. Consider cities. Cain himself founded the first. A city can protect its people, gather resources, and foster culture, but it can also concentrate power, enforce oppression, and multiply rebellion. Cain's city was named after his son, Enoch. Did it become the first stronghold of human pride, a proto-Babel before Babel? When humanity later united to build a tower that reached the heavens, was it simply repeating Cain's original attempt to defy God's command to wander? If so, then Cain's legacy shaped not just his children, but the very trajectory of human civilization. Now return to Enoch, the prophet from Seth's line, who was taken into heaven without tasting death. His writings describe visions of angels bound in chains, stars falling from the sky, and judgment upon the wicked. but they also describe cosmic calendars, measurements of the heavens, and secrets of creation. For centuries, readers wondered, was Enoch preserving divine revelation or unveiling knowledge too dangerous for mortals? Perhaps both. If Cain's descendants embraced forbidden wisdom, perhaps Enoch's writings were the counterbalance, exposing the corruption while also revealing God's ultimate plan for judgment. This may explain why Jude in the New Testament quotes Enoch's prophecy, "Behold, the Lord comes with 10,000s of his holy ones to execute judgment on all." Jude reaches into a banned book to remind believers of God's coming judgment, but the wider church recoiled. To preserve unity, they silenced Enoch, placing his writings outside the canon. In doing so, they buried not only the story of the Watchers, but also the fuller story of Cain's offspring. And yet fragments remained. In Ethiopia, the Book of Enoch was preserved. In fragments at Qumran, the Dead Sea Scrolls confirmed its antiquity. In whispers, its stories survived, hinting at a deeper connection between Cain's city, the fallen angels, and the corruption of humanity. What would it mean if Cain's descendants were not merely cursed wanderers, but the carriers of corrupted wisdom? What if their brilliance was not theirs alone, but seeded by powers that sought to enslave humanity? What if the first city was not only a symbol of survival, but a monument to rebellion? These are questions the canon does not answer, but the banned stories of Enoch force us to ask. And if the line of Cain perished in the flood, did their knowledge perish with them? Or did it survive, passed down through whispers, re-emerging in Babel, in Egypt, in Babylon, in Rome? Civilizations rose, each with music, metallurgy, and cities, each with idols, weapons, and corruption. The echo of Cain seemed to rise again and again. The line was gone, but the legacy remained. As the story moves forward, the pattern becomes undeniable. Human innovation, tainted by rebellion, spreading across generations. And behind it all, the shadow of Cain, the silence of Enoch, and the decision of the church to bury these connections. But burying a story does not erase it. It only drives it deeper into the soil, where it waits like a seed for its season to rise again. And so, as we uncover more of these forgotten fragments, the question presses harder. What else lies hidden in the untold story of Cain's offspring, in the banned visions of Enoch, in the mysteries the church chose to silence? What truths about our own age might these ancient whispers be preparing us to see? The silence of Scripture on Cain's descendants after a few generations has long puzzled interpreters. Was it intentional? Was it divine judgment erasing their memory? Or did ancient communities preserve stories about them that were later hidden from plain view? Early Jewish traditions suggest that Cain's line did not vanish quietly. Some writings describe them as wandering tribes, restless, haunted, bearing the mark that both protected and isolated them. Others insist that Cain's children became absorbed into other clans, their influence spreading like dye in water, unseen yet everywhere. In contrast, Seth's line is described as distinct, as those who called upon the name of the Lord. Some traditions even suggest that Seth's children retreated to the mountains, living apart from Cain's city dwellers in an attempt to preserve purity of worship. The image is stark. Two civilizations, side by side. One raised altars of prayer, the other raised walls of stone. One sought the presence of God, the other sought permanence without him. Over time, the tension between them grew unbearable. The writings attributed to Enoch expand this tension. In them, we see a world where the heavens and earth intertwine dangerously, where the Watchers descend, and where Cain's restless spirit seems to find allies in fallen beings. These Watchers are described as giving humanity the arts of war, enchantments, and forbidden sciences. Could this explain why Cain's descendants advanced so quickly in music, metallurgy, and craft? Was their brilliance entirely human, or was it fueled by angelic corruption? This question haunted early Christians. Some saw in Cain's line the archetype of all worldly culture, brilliant but corrupt, dazzling but dangerous. Augustine, in The City of God, would later echo this by describing two cities, the city of man and the city of God. The city of man, he said, was born of pride and destined for destruction. The city of God was born of humility and destined for eternity. Cain's Enoch and Seth's Enoch become symbols of these two cities, one built on rebellion, the other on faith. But the banned writings of Enoch do more than describe angels and giants. They unveil heavenly secrets, visions of cosmic order, and prophecies of final judgment. Why would such writings be considered dangerous? Because they suggest that human history is not random, but part of a larger war between heaven and earth. They suggest that Cain's line was not merely cursed, but strategically entangled in this war. If the Watchers chose to corrupt humanity, Cain's descendants, already bearing rebellion, would have been their easiest allies. To admit this would mean acknowledging that human culture itself was born in a battlefield of light and darkness. And the question grows sharper. Did the flood erase all traces of Cain's line, or did some of their knowledge survive? The Nephilim are said to appear both before and after the flood. How? If the waters destroyed all, how did their shadow linger? Perhaps the forbidden wisdom was preserved, carried into Noah's world through stories, artifacts, or even through the reappearance of rebellion in Ham's descendants. Nimrod, called a mighty hunter, builds Babel not long after. The spirit of Cain's city rises again. The tower becomes a new monument of pride, echoing the walls of Cain's first city. Humanity, scattered by God, still carries within it the restless ambition of Cain. This continuity unsettled the church. To admit that Cain's legacy lived on would undermine the neat division between good and evil lines. Instead, Cain's genealogy was cut short in official readings. Yet apocryphal writings and traditions outside the canon hint that Cain's seed was not easily erased. Some Gnostic sects even inverted the story, claiming secret wisdom was preserved through Cain's line. Others painted Cain as the first victim of cosmic injustice, twisting the narrative entirely. These distortions show just how powerful his story was. Too powerful to be ignored, too dangerous to be told plainly. Meanwhile, Enoch's visions inspired countless apocalyptic traditions. His journeys through the heavens, his dialogues with angels, his pronouncements of judgment shaped later Jewish writings like two Esdras, the Apocalypse of Baruch, and even parts of the Book of Revelation. John's visions on Patmos echo Enoch's earlier descriptions of cosmic battle, angelic hosts, and final reckoning. To silence Enoch's book was to trim the roots of apocalyptic imagination, limiting the scope of what believers could openly ponder. Yet the shadows remained, and Cain's line still raises its head in history. When the Egyptians mastered metal, when the Mesopotamians raised ziggurats, when Babylon became the city of rebellion, echoes of Tubal-Cain, Jabal, and Jubal can be felt. When armies forged weapons of iron, when kings used music to summon loyalty, when cities multiplied, the fingerprints of Cain's offspring seemed to press upon the world. Could it be that what was born before the flood never fully vanished, but seeped into post-flood civilizations as they rose from the plains of Shinar to the palaces of Pharaoh? This possibility made the church uneasy. For if Cain's legacy endured, then humanity's story was not simply one of salvation breaking into a fallen world, but of two streams running side by side, the stream of rebellion and the stream of redemption. Both shaping culture, both influencing empires, both visible even today. Perhaps this is why certain writings were banned, to protect the faithful from contemplating a reality where the corruption of Cain was not an ancient memory, but a present force. Yet the very act of banning only made the story more alluring. What secrets were they trying to hide? What truths were considered too dangerous for ordinary believers? When the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered and fragments of Enoch reappeared, It was as if the earth itself gave up what the church had buried. Suddenly, scholars saw that these writings were not medieval inventions, but ancient voices, echoing from the time of the Second Temple, perhaps even earlier. Enoch had walked with God, and perhaps his writings still walk with us, haunting our understanding of Cain's forgotten offspring. The rivalry between Cain's civilization and Seth's worshippers is not simply history. It is a lens through which we can see the whole drama of humanity. Every empire, every invention, every song, and every weapon carries within it the same tension. Is this gift of God, or is it the corruption of the watchers? Is this the legacy of Seth's prayer, or the legacy of Cain's defiance? These are not questions of the past. They are questions that follow us still. And so, the story stretches further, into the ruins of Babel, into the halls of Babylon, into the mysteries of Egypt, into the rise of Rome. Each civilization reflects both brilliance and rebellion, both progress and corruption. The shadow of Cain walks beside them, and the silence of Enoch still lingers. The story is not finished, and the questions it raises still demand answers. From the very first pages of Genesis, the story of Cain has cast a long shadow over humanity. His act of envy and violence, the murder of his brother Abel, was not just the first human crime, but the opening of a wound that would never fully heal. Cast out from Eden's presence, bearing a mark that both protected and condemned him, Cain wandered eastward and began a legacy unlike any other. His descendants built the first city, mastered livestock, invented music, and forged metal. They became innovators, artists, and warriors. But with their brilliance came arrogance. With their creativity came corruption. The story of Cain's offspring is a story of culture without covenant, progress without purity, survival without surrender to God. And yet, parallel to this story ran another. From Seth's line came men and women who called upon the name of the Lord. They raised no great cities, but they built altars of prayer. They forged no weapons, but they cultivated worship. Out of their lineage came Enoch, the seventh from Adam, who walked with God until he was no more, taken into heaven without tasting death. His testimony stood in stark contrast to Cain's Enoch, the city builder whose walls crumbled with time. When Enoch built the city of man, the other entered the city of God. Together they symbolized two destinies, two trajectories humanity could choose. But what made this story even more complex was the presence of the Watchers, the angels described in the Book of Enoch. According to these banned writings, they descended to earth, teaching forbidden arts, the use of weapons, the crafting of ornaments, the secrets of the stars, and the corruptions of enchantment. If Cain's descendants were the first to embrace human innovation, were they also the first to embrace this forbidden wisdom? Was Tubal-Cain's forging of bronze and iron simply human genius? Or was it the direct influence of angels who sought to corrupt creation? Was Jubal's music a gift for worship, or an invention twisted into seduction and manipulation? These questions became too heavy, too unsettling for the early church. To preserve unity, to protect the faithful, they silenced the Book of Enoch. Though Jude quoted from it in the New Testament, though early Christians revered it, eventually it was banned in the West, surviving only in Ethiopia and in fragments at Qumran. By erasing Enoch's writings, the church erased much of Cain's untold legacy, his connection to forbidden wisdom, his entanglement with the corruption of heaven and earth. Yet the echoes of Cain's line never truly disappeared. Even after the flood, which wiped the slate of humanity clean, the spirit of Cain seemed to rise again. Nimrod, a mighty hunter, built Babel. The people united to raise a tower to heaven, echoing Cain's first city. Egypt, Mesopotamia, and Babylon carried forward the brilliance of human achievement, but also the arrogance of rebellion. The shadow of Cain walked beside every empire. The silence of Enoch lingered over every civilization. Throughout history, interpreters have wrestled with what this means. Was Cain's line destroyed, or does its spirit still whisper through the ages? Were Enoch's visions merely apocalyptic poetry, or were they revelations too dangerous to tell? The two lines, Cain's and Seth's, represent more than genealogies. They represent two choices humanity always faces: to build apart from God or to walk with Him, to embrace forbidden wisdom or to wait for divine revelation, to trust in cities and weapons or to cling to covenant and worship. In Cain's city, we see the beginnings of human culture, but also the seeds of violence. In Enoch's visions, we see the mysteries of heaven, but also the warnings of judgment. In Cain's descendants, we find the roots of music, metallurgy, and civilization, but also the roots of pride, polygamy, and bloodshed. In Seth's descendants, we find the roots of prayer, prophecy, and covenant, culminating in Noah and the preservation of life. These two stories are not just ancient memories, they are the twin streams of human history still flowing through our world today. By banning the Book of Enoch, the Church closed the door on one half of this tension. By excluding Cain's legacy, they simplified the story, but the fragments remain. And when we listen to them, when we piece them together, we see a picture both terrifying and profound. The first murderers' children were also the first inventors. The prophet who walked with God was also the prophet who saw the corruption of angels. The flood erased the line of Cain, but not the influence of his spirit. The silence of the canon could not erase the whispers of tradition. And so we arrive at the heart of the mystery. The story of Cain and Enoch is not just about genealogy, but about destiny. It is about how humanity wrestles with knowledge, power, and pride. It is about how innovation can be twisted into destruction, how wisdom can be corrupted into sorcery, how cities can become monuments of rebellion. But it is also about how one man, Enoch, walked so closely with God that he transcended death itself. This is the contrast the early church feared would unsettle the faithful. This is the tension they tried to silence by burying Enoch's writings. But history cannot be silenced. The whispers remain, and they tell us that the line of Cain and the visions of Enoch still matter. They remind us that culture without covenant leads to corruption. They remind us that walking with God is the only path that leads beyond death. Cain's offspring, the forbidden wisdom of the Watchers, the visions of Enoch, these are not just fragments of lost history. They are warnings, they are testimonies, they are reminders that humanity is always standing between two cities, the city of man, built on pride, and the city of God, entered only by those who walk with Him. And so, as we look back on these ancient stories, Cain's restless descendants, Enoch's heavenly journey, the Church's silencing of forbidden knowledge, we are left with a choice. Which city will we build? Which wisdom will we seek? Which legacy will we follow? The untold story of Enoch and Cain's offspring banned by the Church is not just a forgotten history. It is a mirror held up to every generation, a mirror held up to us, and what we see in it will shape the story yet to come.